At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hi, here's your report.
Thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire a whole team of yous.
Try posting a job on LinkedIn. It's the world's largest professional network. Unlike resumes, LinkedIn gives a real-time view into a candidate's skills, experiences, and more.
Huh, let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Find your perfect match with LinkedIn. Post your free job at linkedin.com/achieve. That's linkedin.com/achieve. Terms and conditions apply.
Este episodio es presentado por Honda. Descubra la nueva Honda Passport Trail Sport Todoterreno. La Passport más todoterreno que Honda haya imaginado jamás. Esta Passport cuenta con mayor altura al suelo, barras de techo en todas sus versiones y neumáticas especialmente diseñados para cualquier terreno. Además, disfruta todos tus viajes con el control de clima de 3 zonas, techo panorámico y opciones como asientos delanteros con calefacción y ventilación. Conoce más en honda.com/Passport.
We're gonna carry on and plan the sequel, because let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel. Ah!
And welcome back to Microqueers. It's our queer horror movie review, and I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace, and to celebrate our episode on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari this week, we are covering its pseudo-sequel, Dr. Caligari, from 1989, directed by Stephen Sayadian.
Yes, yeah, and this was written by Sayadian as well as Jerry Stahl, who you have put in our notes is responsible for Bad Boys 2?
Okay, so the reason I put this in my notes is because I was trying to find, like, just any kind of, like, how did this get made for this movie, and I gathered that a lot of it is on a Blu-ray release that came out about 3 or 4 years ago, but in the Blu-ray.com, very negative review for this movie.
Oh, gosh, okay.
They made sure to point out, like, and this guy, Jerry Stahl, who, believe it or not, would go on to write Bad Boys 2.
I mean, let's be clear, folks. If you have not seen Dr. Caligari, this is a weird film. So this is the definition of not for everybody.
Oh, 100%. And I think we talked about this offline when we recorded our Cabinet of Dr. Caligari episode, Joe, where I kind of said, you know, I had seen this before because a friend brought this to movie night. And granted, it was a friend who we kind of knew, like these are the kinds of films he often brings to the party. So I knew an inkling of what to expect, but oh my God, this movie.
Oh my God, yeah. Okay, so folks, if you have not seen this, it's relatively accessible most places. Like, I think this is easily on Shudder, right?
Yeah, I watched it on Shudder.
Yeah, so easy to find. If you've not watched it, the plot is the granddaughter of an infamous doctor, i.e. Dr. Caligari, experiments with hormone and shock therapies at her asylum for the insane. And that's putting it mildly. Trace, you described this to me as basically John Waters makes Dr. Caligari.
Yes. And I guess, I don't know, did you think that was an apt comparison?
I think so. I don't necessarily think the visual styling of it, like in some ways this is an update on the visual imagery that we talked about that was so surreal in the original film, except that because it's in color, we go neon. But the dialogue feels like very, very John Waters. It's all nonsensical, just kind of pontificating about bullshit, doesn't really mean anything. And yet, if you like it, if you vibe with it, I think this movie could be a really fun time. My biggest issue is that this motherfucker is just way too long.
Yes, I think its shtick, for lack of a better phrase, gets... Yeah. Its point is made old. 30 minutes in, yeah. So to the point where even though this is only like a 78-minute movie, I found myself quite bored for a lot of the back half.
Yes, yeah. I don't think I could endorse this movie. Like, folks, if you're curious, by all means, check it out. But I feel like you could scroll ahead to any point in the film, watch about 5 to 10 minutes. You will get the idea. If you're enjoying it, keep watching. But if you're not, it doesn't change.
Yeah, like, I'm sitting like right in that kind of 2.5 thing where like I didn't hate this movie, but it did try my patience several times. But at the same time, there was just so much here that I do admire a lot of parts of it, even if by the time it ends, I'm kind of like,
thank God.
Oh,
Yay.
God. So, I mean, it's an experimental recommend, but I will say, Joe, I will remember this movie.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. Like, there are some sequences and some characters in here. Well, I mean, you could argue there's only characters in this film because there's no actual characters and there's no arcs, but everybody is delivering a performance.
And it's all so weird. There's so many like surreal, like, the way characters like enter the scene, like they're wheeling on a skateboard or something. Like, I mean, just random things. And so to go back to my initial like statement where I was like, well, I wanted to know like, how did this get made? And the basic idea I have. So according to Sayadian, the original idea for Dr. Caligari came from the owner of Excalibur Films, once the biggest retailer of adult films in America.
Oh, interesting.
I know. So this guy cut the check for $100,000 to basically say, someone make me a sequel to Caligari. And he was confident in this guy, Stephen Sayadian, because Sayadian had just directed an X-rated project called Cafe Flesh and quote-unquote met the expectations. So
the low bar of meeting the expectations.
Yeah, he got the job. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is that Sayadian claims that everything in this movie was scripted and storyboarded, to which I say, that is the most organized mess I have. I almost don't believe it.
Okay, so I initially balked as well, but then I thought back to some of the sequences that we're going to talk about, and I realized you mentioned it, like the way the characters move in and out of frame, the way that the camera moves, a lot of the setup. I do feel that this is very heavily scripted because we wanted to achieve a very specific effect.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I guess it's like, and maybe that's a boon for the movie. Like, it just seems like such a mess, but it's so carefully crafted to not make it seem like it's carefully crafted. I don't know.
I think the storytelling is a mess, and I think that the technical execution is very strong. Like, I think we can agree or disagree on whether or not this film is successful in terms of telling a story, in terms of having characters, but in terms of the way it pulls off its look and the way that it is dedicated to seeing that through, I think it's unimpeachable.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there are some sets in this movie that I was like, that looks so cool. I'm thinking about
cool. Yeah,
the bubbling like green swamp type place. I don't know what we would call it, to be honest. Like, the sense of geography isn't really a thing here. We're just in a bunch of wild rooms.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, we're supposed to be in people's houses at one point, but it looks exactly like the asylum that Dr. Caligari apparently never leaves.
But with those metal breastplates?
Yes. I mean, the costuming is also wild because this is all neons and pastels. It's very, very late 80s. So in that regard, it is on point. Like, I think I had a bathroom that was also pink and, teal. So.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that they didn't have to actually like paint some of this stuff. It was just there.
Yeah, it would have been styling for the time, but obviously even the way that characters, disrobe and the way that we're using sex and nudity, like, sure, do women just doff their top at a moment's notice in this? Absolutely. Is the movie completely obsessed with sex? Absolutely. Yes. Like, in some ways, it does feel like a very modern update on some of the ideas of the original Dr. Caligari.
So I guess in that sense, though, I mean, like, would you ever, like, if you were showing people The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the original film, would you pop this on and be like, oh, and here's the 50 years later sequel, or I'm sorry, the 60 years later sequel?
No. I think I would pick out a couple of key sequences and be like, here's what the sequel looks like.
And that's the thing, is like, as a sequel, like, nothing in this movie, I mean, we have that, you know, Caligari in this film is the granddaughter of Caligari in the original film, but that's really where the similarities stop. Yeah, exactly. Pretty much that.
Like, obviously, the visual look of it is very similar as well. But narratively, yeah, no, it's basically just, oh, she's a wild, mad doctor. But you could also tell me this is Dr. Frankenstein's granddaughter. And I would have said, like, oh, okay, well, I guess the difference is that she's not playing God. Although she is, to a certain extent.
I mean, everyone, the things that happen in this movie, I mean, you know, we have a nymphomaniac woman named Mrs. Van Houten who's like in therapy with Dr. Caligari, but then we also have this cannibal guy named Gus. And so Caligari's idea is to basically like inject some of Mrs. Van Houten's brain.
It's hormones, right?
Yeah, the hormones that make her an nymphomaniac into the cannibal, and then put some of the cannibal's hormones into the nymphomaniac, and therefore it will balance both of them out. And so she's doing all of these weird kinds of experiments while we have these other doctors on the side who constantly smoke cigarettes, who are eating sheep trotters, because that's a thing that happens in this movie.
I had to look it up to see if that was even a real thing. Apparently it is.
Yeah, it's like sheep's feet, right?
Yes. Yeah, we do see them actually working their way through them at one point, but I was like, that can't be a thing people actually do, is it?
Well,
but
no,
not in this way.
Yeah, they don't serve them with the wool still on the bone.
No.
And then we also get some queerness, you know, because we do have a doctor that's essentially turned into a,
Well, this is forced transness.
Yes.
So this is like...
But it plays off as more of a drag type thing than transness, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. The reason I would say trans is because we are literally taking female hormones and sticking them into a man, and then the man begins dressing and acting like a woman. But you're right, the result, like the visual look of this character, Dr. Aval, is very draggy.
Yeah. And that's all happening in the last, 10 minutes of this movie.
Yeah. So, folks, we're not, going to go through anything in particular, but Trace, I'm curious, did you have a favorite character that you really liked in this?
So, honestly, it may be cliche to say, but I actually really liked Madeleine Renal's Caligari. The cadence she has in delivering lines. And I think you could be forgiven for saying it's a bad acting job. I don't even know if I would call it good, but I did find it very watchable. It was very deadpan and funny for me.
Yeah, one of the things that I asked you before we first watched this was whether it was tongue-in-cheek campiness in the vein of something like Killer Condom. And I'll confess, it's not quite that, but it's also not extremely far off. I was thinking back to that mad scientist woman, and this Dr. Caligari is giving a kind of German-esque, it's in the look, but also in the line delivery from this actress. But I also couldn't tell if it was deliberately meant to be German or if she was just meant to be severe. I know the original film is German, so it would make sense, but...
But nevertheless, I mean, every time she was on screen, I was at least hypnotized because I like just listening to her talk and just watching her interact with these people. I mean, it is... There's not, I don't think, a lot of characters to latch onto in this movie. I don't care about really anyone in this movie.
Oh, no. Mm-mm.
But I found her... She's a very handsome woman.
Yes. Question for you. Did the styling remind you of Melanie Griffith in John Waters' Cecil B. Demented?
Oh my God. It's the hair, right?
It's maybe just the hair.
It is just the hair. But yeah, I could totally see that. And I also, when I was making the John Waters comparison, I also just meant in those production values because any of the pre-Hairspray John Waters films had these kind of production values.
Yeah. Where it's a little bit garish, it's a little bit off-putting, but it's also incredibly specific, attuned to the director's interests.
Very much so. So, I mean, because Joe, I know you're a little bit softer on this film than I am, but did you have a favorite character?
So I would have said Mrs. Van Houten because she is way overly sexual and a lot of the things that she does is very fun. She's married to a man who is not quite asexual, but is distinctly uninterested in female sexuality. So the word orgasm makes him spit out his drink at one point.
This is the guy that is basically a doppelganger for David Dastmalchian.
Yes, indeed. Yes. And we get to watch him get fisted without consent when her hand turns it into...
like a big dildo type? Like just a phallic object.
I think it's meant to be a tongue, but what? Who knows?
I think Mrs. Van Houten's great because I think I was most impressed with the performances and specifically line readings of Laura Albert as Mrs. Van Houten. But
yes,
similarly, John Durbin as Gus Pratt, because the way that both of these two have to just rattle off lines
nonsensical
and in rapid succession too. Like I was mostly just impressed that they could do this.
Which again leads me to think, oh, okay, that heavily scripted and planned and prepared, like you would have to practice this line delivery, because even when characters are speaking to each other and then looking at the camera and then blowing smoke at each other and then speaking to the camera, like it is very choreographed in a lot of ways. I don't always love it, but it was often enthralling to watch.
Yeah. Okay, so then I guess because there's a lot of visual imagery in this movie.
And yet, in our notes, we both singled out the exact same sequence as the one that we would probably highlight.
And I'm going to say that you probably liked it because it's very Cronenbergian.
Oh my God. I mean, it's basically Mrs. Van Houten filleting a super long, giant-sized tongue that sticks out of a door. But it is Videodrome to a T.
Well, and we get instances of Videodrome earlier because, like, specifically when Mrs. Van Houten is watching the TV and, you know, the woman on the TV is, like, talking to her, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
But yes, this...
Debbie Harry.
Yes, it's like a flesh wall that is breathing, and then a tongue slides out of the middle of it. And this thing looks so gross, but it's also so cool looking. Like, I don't think I've ever just seen someone play with a giant tongue before.
No, and initially you just think, oh, it's very long. And like when I say she's filleting it, like she is giving head to this tongue, but then the tongue changes and becomes giant to the point where it looks like she is a child who is being licked by it, but it's also burning her because it's super hot and like she's getting blisters and her face is turning lobster red. It's wild. It's a wild sequence.
That's the thing is like, I think you could show people like just random like sequences from this movie just and say, like, look, isn't that wild? And they'd be like, oh my God, I want to see that. But when you put it all together, it just doesn't make a cohesive whole for me.
I think it's also a bit maximist. It doesn't have levels to it, so it's just always operating at full-blown crazy town. And I don't say that lightly. Like, so much of this is very surreal, intentionally so, but it's a bit like a fever dream, right? Like, all of these people are ill, and you start to feel ill, like mentally ill after a while, because you wonder, like, have I forgotten my medication? What am I even watching right now?
And so on that level, you could argue, hey, the film accomplished what it set out to do. Like, this is an assault.
I think so.
Like, every single scene is an assault. And as you said, it's always at, like, level 11. It never dips. There are no ebbs and flows here. It is always at this level.
Yeah, so I will confess, there were times where I got bored just because it was always at the same level.
Yeah.
But also, I left the film mildly exhausted.
Yeah.
I was just like, that was a lot. It felt like it was a full hour 40. And when you were like, well, this is a 75-minute movie.
And I think I said that too, where I was like, it feels a little long.
Yes. Yeah. I think if this was a short, this would have been an absolute 10 out of 10 for me. Like, it would have been so successful. But to watch it as a full film, I kept having to pause because I found that I had gotten distracted. I was suddenly on my phone or looking at the window, and it was like, okay, I think if it had just been pared down, it would have worked so much better for me.
Well, because, I mean, there is a plot here. It's nonsensical, but, like, there is a plot, but it's also, like, it's one of those movies where, like, if you miss even a scene, even if it's a nothing scene, you might have no idea, like, if you miss something that was important. I mean, again, it's just a big Rubik's Cube of a thing.
I mean, all of it is important and none of it is important. So, yes. Yeah.
So, I don't know, everyone. I mean, check this out on Shudder. At the very least, as we said, you won't forget watching this movie.
No, jump ahead to that tongue scene. You'll know it as soon as you see it. Just give that a gander. And then if you're interested, watch a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. But until next time, everyone, we can cross out Dr. Caligari.
Indeed. And cross out microqueers.